It is my pleasure to introduce Susan Rufo as the Director of Ecosystem Services for the Nature Conservancy. I think we've already heard about the Nature Conservancy several times today. And Susan is actively doing what we're all talking about, and that is bringing together scientists, economists, and policy folks at the Nature Conservancy to work on ecosystem services as a tool for conservation. So we will hear from Susan, and then we'll move right into the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina, and thank you for putting together this conference and bringing everyone together and inviting me. I'm really pleased to be able to share some of our experiences in this area. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit today about the Nature Conservancy and who we are, just so you know what perspective we're coming from. Talk about some of the issues that we've faced when we look at ecosystem services, some of our experiences on the ground when we tried to use these approaches, and then some of the things we've learned from our experience. The Nature Conservancy is a conservation organization, as you can probably tell from our name, and has been mentioned earlier today. We are famous for buying land and preserving it, and we own and manage millions of acres of conservation easements and private land preserves across the United States. What a lot of people don't know about us is that we're the world's largest conservation organization. We work in all 50 states and 35 or so countries across the world. We do buy land, but that's mostly in the U.S. Outside of the U.S. and even in the U.S. increasingly, we work with government partners, NGO partners, private sector partners to look at different policies related to conservation, to try innovative private sector approaches like buying fishing licenses and working with fisher people to develop sustainable practices. We work on conservation financing mechanisms like debt for nature swaps. So we like to think of ourselves as practical, solution-oriented, and very partner-driven when we think about conservation. So not surprisingly, the idea of ecosystem services is very appealing to us because the places that we work and that we protect are places that provide ecosystem services for people. We believe that we should protect nature, not just for nature, but also for people. So this is an important link for us, and we're very excited to talk about what we're doing and also to learn about some of the cutting-edge science that we can be applying. Now, we've hit a lot of problems when we do this, and I think a lot of them are summed up in this quote from Benjamin Franklin, and you can extrapolate from water to any kind of ecosystem service here. I think implicit in this quote is the idea that water and other services have value, and it's significant value, but in the normal course of events, we take that for granted. We don't really know what that value is. We continue on our daily lives. It's only when we hit some sort of crisis or some sort of problem that we start to really think about the value of water. What we're trying to do is make sure that we think about that value before we hit the crisis, because even when restoration is effective, it's still often a lot more costly, and we'd really like to save the places before they get destroyed, and we think it's important, again, both for people and nature. So one of the places I'd like to talk about that we're working are the Northern Tropical Andes, and we're doing projects related to payment for watershed services, or what we call water funds. And just to give you a sense of where I'm talking about, here's a map. Mostly we're focused in Colombia and Ecuador with these projects. We were attracted to this region originally because of the biodiversity. 20% of the world's species are found here. Not only plants, but amphibians and insects and mammals, things like pink river dolphins and giant river otters. It's an amazing place. And our staff that work there like to think of it as a freshwater superpower. There are major rivers like the Magdalena and the Orinoco that flow through there. There are also ecosystems like high-altitude páramos that act as big sponges and draw water from the atmosphere and send it down Andean streams. So an important place for biodiversity, important place for people, but also under threat. There's oil exploration and pollution. Agricultural runoff and sedimentation are affecting these watersheds and these streams, not only in the upper watersheds, but all the way down into the ocean where they're coming out into the sea. And it has obvious effects on people. Flooding is more common, but sort of more random. Freshwater species or populations are declining, as they are everywhere in the world. And people like this gentleman in the canoe are having trouble finding fish. Just as one example, in the Magdalena River, the last 15 years, fish catches are down 80%. So obviously that has a huge impact on the people who depend on these services. So the question is, what do we do? How can we figure out how to match up this green infrastructure, these places that store water and clean water with the impacts downstream and the things that people need. And what we came up with in the year 2000 is a very simple model of a water fund. We started in Quito, Ecuador, looking at protected areas in the upper watershed above that city. And what we did is try to work with partners in that area to put together water users with a very simple and transparent funding mechanism to link them to the people who provide basically the water and the services that they're looking at. So in the case of Quito, we worked with the Municipal Water Authority, we worked with beverage bottlers, we worked with the hydropower company, and on the provider side, we work with national parks, with other protected areas, with people who are up there living and working the land and farming it, and trying to bring them all together in a way that makes sense. And the model, I think, has been pretty successful. We actually started, I would say, without most of the science that we were talking about today. With a general understanding that this seemed like a good idea, that people agreed that this would be helpful, that it would get these people what they wanted in terms of clean water, that it would hopefully also help people upstream. The fund was originally started with about $20,000. It's now up to about $5 million. I don't know what the payoff is these days given the economic crash, but it was over $1 million at one point, and it also attracted a lot of support from agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development, who looked at it as a development tool as well as a conservation tool. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is figure out who these providers are and how do we reach them. And as Professor Norgaard said last night, it's pretty hard to pay for water or clean water. So what you end up paying for are really the land changes or land uses that make a difference in terms of water. So we focused on a few different things. One is actual land use change. As I said, agriculture and grazing are threats in these watersheds. And if you look at the picture on the left, you can see what it looks like now. Picture on the right is sort of an image of what it could look like if you reforest steep slopes and build riparian buffers so that you're essentially cutting down on sedimentation. And what this fund does is provide incentives to the people who live here and who farm these areas to put in place these kinds of systems. The second thing is to look at the people who live here and what do they need to sort of have a good life. Why, they don't choose to degrade their watersheds. They don't want to destroy the environment, but they need to make a living. They need to have a good life. So what do they need? So a lot of these funds invest in human well-being projects like schools or like community gardens or like small-scale businesses, milk processing and other things. They also provide employment for park guards, which ties into the third piece of this puzzle, which is strengthening protected areas. All of the watersheds that we work in have upstream protected areas. These are places that are forested or have these paramo ecosystems that are really important for water supply and for water quality, but they're underfunded and they're being degraded. They're being encroached on, they're being deforested, and the countries themselves often don't have the resources to put into this. So another way these water funds work is by helping to fund these protected areas. They provide jobs for local people, but also make sure that these areas are effective and not just paper parks, as we say. So, like I said, when we started in Quito, we really didn't have a lot of science or economics behind us. We've repeated that model. There are about 12 funds now in the region that are in various stages of conception and implementation. The latest one is the Bogota Water Fund, which was launched about 3 weeks ago. And there we did try to be a little bit more scientific to make a stronger business case, if you will. And one of the things we did with some of our partners is model sedimentation and what it looks like for different land uses in that watershed. So you can see in the conserved area, sedimentation is pretty low. Inside the protected area where there's encroachment, where people are grazing, sedimentation is growing. Outside the protected area where people are using the land pretty intensively, sedimentation is 10 times what it is in the conserved area. So how do we change the incentives and change practices to make a difference here? And that's what we're basically aiming to do. Now, this is a model. So this is what we think will happen. And I think, as others have pointed out, what we really need now to do is figure out, is this really happening? I think one of the big challenges with these types of systems is, we all have theories about what works and what doesn't. We have some really good science about sedimentation, but when we actually set these things up, we need to make sure that people are getting what they pay for, both for the long-term success of these funds as well as any kind of replicability. So we believe it's really important to go back and measure what's been happening in these places. And that's what we're doing right now, is developing these monitoring protocols to look at a bunch of different things. One is hydrology, to figure out, what are the effects on water quality, what are the effects on flood mitigation, if any. We're looking at socioeconomic factors, what is happening in terms of improvement to water sources and who is it benefiting? What's happening to rural livelihoods and the people who live up in these watersheds? And then, because we're a conservation organization, we obviously care a lot about whether this is making a difference for biodiversity and conservation, because ultimately, for us, we always come back to that as our sort of core mission. So those are projects that have been well underway, and we've learned a lot from them. I want to share with you another example of a project that's really in the exploration phase. And I think it's interesting because it's raising a lot of these questions up front, and we're trying to answer them. So this is the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta in California. And you can see the Sacramento River is flowing down from the north. The San Joaquin River is flowing up from the south. In the middle, you see all of these agricultural lands. This is about a 700,000-acre delta. It's very rich farmland, peat soils that have been farmed for over 100 years. And as a result of this very intensive land use, the delta is actually sinking. The land is subsiding. So the green areas, I don't know how much you can see this, but the green areas are basically sea level and above, sinking down to red, which is below 15 feet or more below sea level. And some of these places are actually 25 feet below sea level. The only reason that they still function as farms is because they're set off by a system of levees that, not surprisingly, are under increasing pressure. And increasing risk of failure. Now, obviously, for the people who farm here, that would be a catastrophe. But the situation is actually even worse than that, because a lot of California's water actually flows through this delta, both because of the natural flows in the state as well as the way California has plumbed its water systems. A lot of it flows from here and actually gets pumped south into the Central Valley, where there's significant agriculture, to the city of Los Angeles, where it provides some of the city's drinking water. So flooding and levee failure here would mean probably inundation by saltwater, which would then get pumped to all of these other places. Clearly an outcome that we want to avoid. In addition, because of the way these lands are farmed and because of the peat soils, it's actually a significant source of carbon emissions. So they've actually estimated that about 3% of the state's total emissions come from this area. All of which I think we see as an opportunity. And the U.S. Geological Survey has been doing research for over 15 years in the Delta, looking at possible ecosystem services. And we think, and they think, that there's a vision of the Delta that could be changed. It could be an ecosystem services platform instead of maybe what it is today. And looking at USGS's research and others, we've sort of identified some key ecosystem services that we think are important. One is the land accretion. Basically, the way this works, is to change agricultural practices not only into lower impact and sort of low carbon farming, but also to radically change over to a system where people would actually farm native wetland grasses. They're called tule, and there's a couple of pictures here on the slide. And the idea is that these grasses actually sequester carbon, and at the same time as they grow, they help to sort of build up the land again. So over decades, if managed, they could potentially sequester a lot of carbon as well as kind of help build up some of these places that have subsided significantly. So in this new vision of the Delta, under this carbon capture farming, we see potential for all of these ecosystem services: land accretion, carbon sequestration, and this hazard mitigation. And, of course, because we are a biodiversity organization, we also care a lot about the fact that it's a flyway, that endangered species live here, it's a nursery for fish, which we believe there are also some very important conservation benefits. There are a lot of challenges here, and this is what we're starting to look at. Predominance of private land ownership is a big issue. There are people who have lived here and farmed this land, sometimes for generations, and getting them to accept this very new way of looking at things is a challenge, and giving them the right incentives to do it is also a challenge. Not only is there an economic bottom line, but there's a cultural and sort of usual way of doing things that have to be overcome. There's a lack of understanding in terms of what kinds of benefits that this new system can bring, and how people would actually benefit for it and how it would work. So I think explaining this strategy in a way that makes sense to people and to many different audiences is a challenge. And then there's also a lack of policy and science frameworks to even make it happen. Right now, basically, a lot of our hopes and desires and our sort of picture of viability of this system hinges on a carbon market, which doesn't exist yet. So even though when you hear the story and you look at this delta, you think, wow, the chance of this flooding and destroying the water supply for Los Angeles, that's a huge issue. But how do you value that? It's a small chance of it happening. Could happen way in the future. What do you do about that? But carbon, there's actually possibly a potential market there. It's easier to measure. We have 15 years of science about carbon sequestration in this place, as well as pending legislation in California that might set up this market. So at least for the moment, the viability of this project really hinges on carbon. And the other benefits, even though they may be really, really important, are basically co-benefits. So the Conservancy is working with our partners, USGS and the University of California, Environmental Defense Fund, National Resources Defense Council, to try and fill some of these gaps and to identify services and talk about some of the ways that we can move forward and come up with a game plan. And that's where it stands now, so stay tuned. But I wanted to share a little bit about what we've learned from these projects and others like them. The first thing is we need to be able to communicate the value of nature. And we've talked about that a lot today. And I think it can't be said enough. And I think Amy said it very well. Decisions are being made all the time. And right now, nature is basically a zero in all of those columns. And even if we don't know what that number should be, we know it's not zero, and we don't want it to be zero. So we need to figure out a way to change the way people think about this so that there is some value in that column. And I guess this is where I would respectfully disagree, is I don't think that has to be a dollar value. And I think sometimes we distract ourselves by trying to come up with that dollar value because we get into arguments about valuation, we get into arguments about methods, and we forget that sometimes if we talk about the 1,000 people who live in the village or the number of jobs that might be lost or other things like that, that are quantities, that are numbers, that are values, sometimes you can get a politician's attention with that. And it doesn't have to be a number that then you get to argue about. So I'll put that out on the table for maybe future discussion. As I mentioned before, I think monitoring is essential. I think we're asking people to pay for services, and I think that we should be sure we're delivering them. And the last thing which came up earlier as well is that we need to understand some of the possible consequences of this. And the Delta Project is a good example of this, because wetlands, when people think of wetlands and carbon sequestration, they often are very skeptical because wetlands produce a lot of gases like methane and nitrous oxide that actually are greenhouse gases. So the carbon balance of wetlands is not clear. There are sort of science questions there. In the Sacramento Delta in particular, there's also a legacy of mercury left over from the gold rush days. And if we sort of replant wetlands and manage them for carbon, are we releasing more mercury that basically gets into the food supply? We need to understand what that means. And I think the point was made earlier, if we focus on one service, we're likely affecting others, and we need to understand what we're trading off. So it's hard, but we need to think as much as we can about the big picture and the different consequences of it. So I guess I would like to leave it with that, and thank you all again for inviting me. And I'm happy to take some questions if anybody has any. Or not. All right, thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You mentioned several times monitoring, and which I think is incredibly important for all of these sort of versions of payment for environmental services or whatever programs. And so I wonder if you guys have thought about, in economics, we've thought for years about how different policies are different, both in terms of efficiency, cost effectiveness, but also enforcement costs. Some policies are very expensive to enforce and others aren't, and those are real costs. And so have you even contemplated doing little experiments to see, if we tried this policy here and that policy there, and then see how it goes and which ones are easy to enforce and which ones aren't, then that could help you design programs in other places to reduce enforcement costs?
In these projects, I would say we probably haven't, and part of the reason is because they're completely voluntary. So we're not, other than the formation of a carbon market, we're not really relying on a policy or regulatory framework. One of the things that we are looking at, we have a large project in Indonesia that's looking at sort of practical implications of how you would do a RED project. So, Indonesia has really high deforestation rates. If you were to actually do large-scale projects and try to get carbon credits for avoiding that deforestation, what does that mean? And I think in that context, we are thinking very seriously about enforcement because so much of that deforestation is illegal already. So how do you address that? There are 50 years of sort of forest conservation that hasn't been able to solve that problem. But yeah, so we're thinking about it in that context. I think to the extent that we've stayed in the voluntary market range, we haven't thought about enforcement, but it is a really good point. Sir?
I noticed your biography has you working overseas in a different organizational framework.
Yes.
Would you be willing to make any comments about the effectiveness of not so much your work personally, but your work within your organizational setting in overseas biodiversity hotspots? I'm particularly interested in the Philippines, but anywhere in Southeast Asia would be of interest to me, or other areas where you've had your own personal experiences that you could speak about.
Sure. We don't actually work in the Philippines, so I can't speak at all about the Philippines, other than in the context of a larger initiative that we're working on. So I'll speak a little bit. I used to work for the Conservancy's Asia Pacific group as well as for the State Department where I was posted in Asia. So I think that's what you were referring to. So just as an example of the type of work that we're doing, we work in Indonesia, in the Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea, that are all part of this region that's been identified as scientists as what we're calling the Coral Triangle, although if you look at the map, it's really kind of a big blob. And basically, it's a center for coral diversity. It has the most species of corals found anywhere in the world. And what we've been doing is working with 6 governments in that region, so that includes the Philippines, to come up with a multi-nation plan for addressing basically marine conservation in that region. And it's called the Coral Triangle Initiative for Food Security and Marine Conservation. And I think that title alone shows you how important ecosystem services are, because the reason these governments are involved is that they care about the people who rely on these resources. They care about people, they're subsistence farmers, they're fishermen, so they're parts of the economy that matter, but also people who rely on this who have nothing else to turn to. And I think that the Conservancy has been effective in these areas because we work with these governments, with these communities, and we try to address this looking at the lens of what their needs are. And being supportive. I mean, we lend technical expertise that maybe they don't have. We lend resources and experiences from other places that maybe they wouldn't have access to. So in that respect, I think that we can be very effective. And in some ways, it's easier to work in a non-governmental organization because you don't have as many of the formal protocols that you would have in a governmental organization. So that's been my personal experience. And actually, it reminded me of another point on the valuation, which is I think when you look at valuing ecosystem services and you think about people like subsistence farmers, you may get a very, very small dollar value, but in terms of the number of people in Indonesia that would impact, it's huge. So again, dollar values may not be the right metric there. It may be more about number of communities that rely on the resource and number of people that might be displaced if it weren't there. So, any other questions? Ma'am.
Thank you for making that last point. I come from India, and it's something that's been on my mind while I've been listening. I also had a question for you. In your work in South America, have you noticed any cultural difference as far as why people are valuing the ecosystems? Is it just the dollar value, or are they going because of the subsistence farming and the other issues that you just brought up?
That's a great question. And I think what we found is a lot of the people that we're talking to on the user side of the equation maybe think about it in the same way that maybe a U.S. user of water would think about it in terms of their municipal water authorities, their breweries, their bottlers, their hydropower companies that care about their reservoirs silting up. What we found is cultural issues are extremely important when you're dealing on the provider side, because people there are participating in these schemes for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are because there are cultural reasons and they care about this environment. Some of it is more about community. Actually, in these places, it's very interesting, particularly in Ecuador, there are no direct payments to these communities. They're all in-kind payments. So they involve providing fencing so that people can fence off riparian areas or building a school. And that's seen, the idea of actually paying for these services and giving people money is seen as really culturally not acceptable. So we do have to be, I think, very careful and very sensitive to this. And in our case, my colleagues in those countries are from those countries and are very tuned into these issues, but it does mean that there's no one-size-fits-all, and it's a really important consideration that we can't overlook.